The name Sofia Gubaidulina is typically not associated with serial music, but she experimented with the technique in a few works not long after completing her studies at the Moscow Conservatory in 1963. Gubaidulina was one of the last of her generation to experiment with serialism. Her first serial works came some 10 years after Volkonsky's initial attempts, and she produced only a few works that used the technique. In addition to the piano sonata under consideration here, these works include the Five Etude for harp, double bass, and percussion from 1965, the cantata A Night in Memphis from 1968, and the toccata truncata for piano from 1971. In his 2005 essay Andrei Volkonsky and the Beginnings of Unofficial Music in the Soviet Union, Peter Schmeltz chronicles the arrival of serialism in the Soviet Union during the mid 1950s. Of the avant-garde techniques that poured into the Soviet Union, serialism was quickly adopted by many young composers, including Volkonsky, Edison Denisov, and Alfred Schnittke. Volkonsky, generally credited as the first Soviet serial composer, admits that he misunderstood the 12-tone technique. His misunderstanding led to a uniquely Soviet approach to serialism that spread among others in his circle, including Gubaidulina. For Gubaidulina, serialism was not an aesthetic, but rather a technique to be mastered like 16th century counterpoint or fugue. She tells Enzo Rastagno, "My relationship with serialism did not develop in the same way as that of other composers, especially Schnittke and Denisov. I approached dodecaphony as a researcher, analyzing it as eagerly and thoroughly as one would any historical period. For me, dodecaphony was already a fully matured and possibly even historically complete tradition, and for this reason I set myself the task of moving beyond it." Piano Sonata represents her first attempts to grapple with serialism. It is also one of her last pieces to employ fairly traditional formal structures. Some compartments of the form are filled with fairly diatonic or freely atonal pitch material. Others feature fairly liberal use of the 12-tone method. I'm going to focus on the second movement, which provides a good summary of Gubaidulina's serial techniques, and then I'll touch on the opening of the third movement. The second movement's musical material is almost recitative-like. The form is best described as A-B cadenza A'. Here we see the first four measures of the second movement. A C-sharp major triad in the bass is tied over from the first movement. The second chord, marked with a fermata, introduces the first 5 notes of the row. The remaining 7 notes are presented in measure 3. Incidentally, the zigzag in the first measure of the right hand indicates that the performer strummed the pegs inside the piano with a bamboo stick. In measure 7, there is another 11-note gesture in the left hand and a sustained E flat in the right hand. The material in this measure is taken from the I3 form of the row. This E flat is the principal pitch class of this row form, and it is the only pitch class not included in the 11-note gesture. Gubaidulina repeats the E flat in the right hand over 2 subsequent gestures. Both of these include the E flat in the lower register as well, but neither features E flat as the primary pitch class of the row. After 4 measures of repetition, the E flat continues to be prominent, and it is elaborated by neighboring tones that result from the I3 form of the row. Here we see the musical material from measure 10. The E flat is the inversional axis around which D and F flat are balanced. The F natural on beat 2 acts as a neighbor note, embellishing the E flat. The quarter note chord on the second beat is not exactly inversionally balanced, but certainly suggests inversional symmetry. By measure 20, Gubaidulina has abandoned serial techniques, yet the E flat continues to exert its influence. Clearly, Gubaidulina finds the repetition or emphasis of a particular pitch class unproblematic, contrary to what many people see as a fundamental aspect of the serial aesthetic. This almost obsessive repetition of a single pitch becomes a hallmark of some of her later works, like the Second String Quartet, the String Trio, and Sieben Worte. In her instructions for the cadenza, she writes, performers may use this version of the cadenza for improvisation on any notes. The diamond-shaped note heads call for the performer to strike the string in the lower register with the fingers. The indeterminate aspects of the cadenza contrast to the repeated 0-1-2 ostinato in the left hand. At the end of the second movement, Gubaidulina presents the I3 form of the row unadorned. The third movement uses the same row as the second movement. Gubaidulina gradually introduces the notes of I1 over a rhythmic ostinato. At the opening of the movement, the ostinato consists of only three pitches, C#1, D1, and C2. The opening gesture is characterized by interval class 1, manifest as neighbor motion from C#1 to D1, and as a large leap from C1 to C2. Measure 6 introduces five new pitches, a chord consisting of F sharp, G, and A, and a descending chromatic figure that moves from E3 to E flat 3. The final four pitch classes of the row are introduced in measure 9. The gradual introduction of the 12 pitch classes over roughly 10 measures suggests that, for Gubaidulina, the 12-tone method is not about avoiding emphasis on a particular pitch. The quasi-ostinato that opens the movement asserts the C-sharp C dyad as central.